In this next section, we're going to start delving into some of our more biological sides of things. So we're going to be looking at our evolutionary and also our neurological perspectives. So let's start off by talking about, whoops, wrong way. Let's start talking about our behavioral genetics perspective. So this is going to touch just very, very briefly on some of the concepts related to behavioral genetics, specifically looking at some of our twin studies and adoption studies, which are just two methods that we can use to try and pick apart how much of a particular characteristic or, say, a personality trait is due to either our nature or our genetic component or our nurture or our upbringing. So by looking at sort of different aspects of this, we can start picking apart how much of a trait is sort of governed by our genes and how much is governed by our environment. So specifically, twin studies allow researchers to determine the proportion of a characteristic or trait or behavior that is due to genetics or upbringing. So we can look at the fact that there are two different kinds of twins, and these two types of twins differ in how much genetic material that they share. And so actually, if I hop to the next slide, we can see our two types of twins. We have identical twins, also called monozygotic twins, and they come from a single fertilized egg, which means that they both share 100% of their genetics. So any differences between our identical twins should be due only to environmental effects because their genes are the same. For fraternal twins, or dizygotic twins, they actually come from two separate eggs that have been fertilized at the same time. So they're no more similar than any other siblings that are born. They share 50% of their genetics. So we can look at the difference between sort of shared traits between our identical twins, where they only differ in terms of environment, fraternal twins where they would differ sort of in terms of genetics, but also environment. And we can do some fancy math in the background to figure out how much is contributing from the environment and from our genetics towards a particular trait. When we're evaluating these, so once we've done that sort of hand-waving math in the background, we can calculate either a concordance rate, where we look at the degree to which a characteristic or trait or disease or whatever occurs in one twin and then also occurs in the other. So how often do both twins have that particular trait? Or we might calculate a correlation. So what is which is just another way of sort of measuring what's our relationship here. So how much is due to genetics. And so we can look at a correlation score, in this case, of a couple of different traits that are related to personality. And we see that we have fairly reasonable correlations. And that just means that so this correlation score is specifically calculated to look at identical twins who have specifically been reared in separate environments. So they have the exact same genetics and they have completely different environments that they were raised in. So to interpret this, the higher the correlation, the more similarity there is between these twins. So we'd see very high correlation for absorption and for stress reactions, which are related to imagination and neuroticism, respectively. And then we'd see very low scores with things like social closeness, which is related to intimacy. And what we can conclude from this whole table is that there are lots of variabilities, there's lots of variance in the amount of genetic contributions for different types of personality traits. So we have an average of all of these correlations of about 0.5. So we have a pretty reasonable contribution of our genes. And so we could say that about 50% of the variability can be accounted for by inheritance, so what we get from our genetics, and therefore the rest would be something similar to our environmental input. Some with a lot more genetic contributions, and some with quite a bit less. Next, we're going to start looking at the neurological perspective. So this is when we're examining the extent to which various physiological factors, things like our hormones and neurotransmitters, especially in our brain, and brain activity itself, looking at arousal or energy level, as well as inhibition, sort of a suppression of firing, can determine the expression of certain personality characteristics. So when we start looking at things related to our brain that might be related to our personality traits. So we're going to look at two major hormones slash neurotransmitters. The first of which is testosterone. So this is a male sex hormone, and it's associated with characteristics like dominance, aggression, persistence, sensation seeking, and other high-risk behaviors. So we can typically find a pretty good relationship between testosterone levels, and higher testosterone leads to more of these sort of aggressive and dominant behaviors. Our next thing that we're looking at here is serotonin, and this is an inhibitory transmitter. Inhibitory just means that it's going to decrease our firing in the brain. And low levels of serotonin would be associated with greater willingness to engage in thrill-seeking activities. So if we have less inhibitors in our brain, we're going to see more activity. So it's going to lead to increased thrill-seeking activity, so things related to that in terms of personality. So those are some chemical factors that are related, but we can also look at actual physical structures within the brain. And one of the major ones is the ascending reticular activating system, or ARAS. And this basically acts as a filter that helps regulate arousal or activity level throughout the rest of the brain. And again, we see a strong correlation with this ARAS linked with introversion and extroversion. So in this case, when we have people who score higher on introversion, so people we'd call introverts, they tend to have a higher than average level of cortical activity, and extroverts, or people who score higher with extroversion, the other end of that spectrum, seem to have a lower level of arousal throughout their cortex. So from this, we might conclude that introverts tend to be more socially withdrawn to try and reduce extra stimulation from being around other people. And in contrast, our extroverts would be looking for extra company and extra stimulation to increase the amount of activity to compensate for their lower than average levels that typically exist. The last perspective I want to cover is our evolutionary perspective. And this is when we try and account for differences in personality, specifically using our evolutionary theory. So we have this idea that traits that contribute to survival, whether it is for us to live longer or specifically for us to have higher chances of reproducing, those are going to make it more likely for individuals to survive and to have offspring. And then those traits are going to be more likely to be passed on to their offspring, which means that those traits become more and more common in that population over time. And so we see that there are some links between certain personality traits and the tendency to sort of live longer and survive longer. So conscientiousness is one where we are more likely to engage in health-promoting behaviors and avoid risks. So that would be something that would be likely to be passed on because it helps us avoid dying and to live longer, which would allow us to reproduce more. Optimism is another one that's beneficial because if we have high optimism scores, we're likely to have fewer symptoms when we're sick and also to recover and heal a lot faster. So these are two traits that are pretty strongly linked with being evolutionarily successful or having higher fitness. So those are two behavioral traits that are positively associated with living longer. But we can also have traits that are negatively associated with longevity. So two of these are hostile type A personalities. So this is when you tend to be more hostile and aggressive in your personality. So it's a negative personality characteristic. It correlates negatively with longevity. So if you have this trait, you tend to live for less amount of time. Similar with neuroticism. If you're high in neuroticism, you tend not to live for as long as well. And if we focus in specifically on our chances of reproduction, we do see sex differences, where with women, negative emotions tend to be associated with increased sexual activity, which would lead to increased reproduction. Whereas in men, Increased sexual activity correlates with having high self confidence, high extroversion, and social assertiveness. So basically, being outgoing enough to seek out a partner. So let's critically evaluate this perspective. What are our strengths? So, this gives us a strong emphasis on our biological factors. So, it focuses in on our biology, our genes, surviving and evolving. And because we've seen a lot of data where we have correlations between different traits and different outcomes, we see quite a bit of empirical support for at least different aspects of this perspective. But we have quite a few limitations as well. We don't necessarily understand how certain biological processes are directly related to the specific expressions of personality. Basically, there's a disconnect. We might know that there's a correlation between different traits, but we don't know what's driving it. We don't know the mechanism that's leading to it. And it's also very difficult to start making predictions because with all of our biological processes, and especially with something like personality, it's a very interconnected, complex system. And so it's very difficult for us to understand all the moving parts and make an accurate prediction that we could work from using it.